And we're back here on Debrief and staying in the Middle East. Since early June, the Gulf has been in its worst diplomatic crisis in years. Saudi Arabia leading the charge of several nations cutting off ties with Qatar. And their top demand was this, that Qatar dramatically scale back its ties with Iran. And since President Trump has sided with Saudi Arabia, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has showed support for Qatar. And just this week, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, and Dina Powell paid a visit to both countries. And today, Qatar announcing it has restored full diplomatic ties with Iran, despite all of that. Joining us from our studios in Washington is Mohammed Fraser-Rahim. He's Executive Director at North America at Quilliam International. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
So let's just look at this in the big picture for a moment. When all is said and done, we have 3 months of a diplomatic crisis with Qatar, despite nothing really having been resolved, saying we're resuming full diplomatic ties with Iran. What was the point? What happened here?
You know, this challenge or this debate that we've been seeing for the past 3 months is really a back and forth. I call it an age-old, centuries-old tension between those who are in Saudi Arabia and the Sunni established leadership in the Arabian Peninsula and those who are of the Shia smaller minority in Iran. This tension is certainly one that is playing out in geopolitical capitals throughout the world. We just saw 2 days ago that Chad has now cut off diplomatic relations with Qatar as well. So we're seeing different nations, particularly Muslim nations throughout the world, who are siding and picking sides. It's a chess game, and perhaps the checkmate will be determined for at least the medium or long term as well.
So when all is said and done, do you think that this has ended up strengthening Iran, which was exactly the opposite of what Saudi Arabia was aiming to do?
Well, you know, Iran, once they received once sanctions have been lifted, to some extent, they've been seeing an increase of cash flow. And so because of this money coming back into their country, we're seeing them playing much more of a strategic, important role in many of these games that we're seeing throughout the world. And so Iran is certainly trying to align themselves and provide that necessary support. I think Qatar is just one example of that. And we're seeing this alignment because it's probably mutually beneficial for both of them. Now, what Iran decides to do for the long term is the big question. But at least temporarily, this certainly is part of an important sort of collaboration for them with Qatar.
Mohammed, let's talk about the United States for a moment, because when this split was first announced, President Donald Trump came out on Twitter praising it. He called it sort of a victory, a result of his meeting in Riyadh. Secretary of State Tillerson, on the other hand, seemed to side with Qatar. Is the maybe confused U.S. reaction to this split had a bad effect, a positive effect in your eyes?
Well, you know, this is the big debate right now. I mean, right now, the U.S. State Department, they are working to find their bearings, and particularly with Tillerson as well, who certainly doesn't have a background in some of the foreign policy affairs that we've seen previous Secretary of State. So the jury is still out. I think what you see is a White House that's trying to side and align itself with a long-term partnership with the Saudis. Now, what this will manifest itself in terms of real policy, these are real questions that many of us right here in Washington are trying to figure out, and I'm sure in other strategic capitals throughout the world. And so it's a wait and see. It's one in which we must find out if we will have established policies that can certainly give us a glimpse of an alignment between what's taking place in Foggy Bottom or at the State Department and then what the White House actually decides to and implement for the long term.
So we know that the United States has a long-running and important relationship and defense relationship with Saudi Arabia, but it's also Qatar that is home to the biggest U.S. base in the Middle East. Can the U.S. afford this split to worsen?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's a lot of military officials who are probably giving the president of the United States some proper advisement on what to do. The fact of the matter, this is a strategic location. That's not going to change probably in the foreseeable future. And so that our position there, particularly CENTCOM in particular, is a huge importance, not just for the United States, but those who are in the region who are dealing with the Iranian threat, if you will. And so that balance, I don't see it changing for at least the short or medium term. I think that right now we're just seeing some ruffling of the feathers, and hopefully we'll see where this goes and plays out in the near term as well.
Briefly, Mohammed, do you think that the decisions driving this in the Gulf, the decisions being made by Qatar and by Saudi Arabia, are about money, about economics, or about influence in the Middle East?
You know, this influence issue is a big, I think, the big question for all of us. I think influence certainly has one of the driving factors behind what's taking place. I would imagine this is going to be resolved in some shape or fashion, whether it's privately or publicly. I think that we'll see this develop in some clear fashion, hopefully in the near term, because I think certainly the U.S. administration has to get reach a collective decision on what this will play out. In terms of other Gulf-based countries and GCC countries, I think that you're seeing alignment based off of certainly the important role that Saudi Arabia plays, and then certainly those who have sort of resistance against Iranian aggression and Iranian influence that's certainly taking and making a lot of inroads in the region, and then certainly throughout the globe, as we've seen a large amount of money come into their coffers.
Right, and the White House wading into a pretty volatile mix of interests in that part of the world. Mohammed Fraser-Rahim in Washington, thanks very much for weighing in here. We're going to go out for a quick break.